removing these people and this noise at the bottom of the hill while I'm trying to build. Just give me stronger shoulders, give me stronger hands to keep building, because that's always going to be there. That's the enemy, and that's life. I mean, we're carrying on Charlie's legacy, and there is so much noise. I know I've said this many times before, and there will always be noise. Whenever you are over the target, the enemy, I mean, we're in enemy-occupied territory. There will always be noise, and there will always be people that will distract you. If myself or Charlie spent every single second going down and responding to every accusation, responding to every insult, responding to every judgment, we would get nothing done. We just wouldn't. And at the end of, Nehemiah, he basically was saying, Lord, strengthen my hands. And so I feel the same way. Like, I'm not going to ask God to remove those people from my life. It just makes me stronger. So, Lord, instead of removing these people and this noise at the bottom of the hill while I'm trying to build, just give me stronger shoulders, give me stronger hands to keep building, because that's always going to be there. That's the enemy, and that's life. Mm-hmm. That's life.
They tried to keep this buried. Quiet conversations, closed doors, carefully worded statements meant to control the damage. But something slipped hand. Now the internet is seeing pieces of the story that were never supposed to come out. A new update involving Erika and Charlie Kirk has just resurfaced. It's raising uncomfortable questions nobody is answering directly. Screenshots, leaked claims, and sudden shifts in behavior have people wondering what really happened behind the scenes. Now, more importantly, who knew what and when? What makes this update so shocking isn't just what's being said, but the timing. Just when things seem to calm down, new details are allegedly emerging that don't line up with earlier narratives. Stories are changing, silence is getting louder, and the people who were once eager to speak are suddenly nowhere to be found. Supporters are confused, critics feel vindicated, and everyone else is asking the same question. Why now? If this information is real, it could change how people view the entire situation. And if it was hidden on purpose, the fallout could be far bigger than anyone expected. Because once something escapes the shadows, there's no putting it back, and this update may be just the beginning. What the public saw was calm, controlled statements, carefully chosen words, a narrative that felt finalized. But behind that polished surface, something was clearly unresolved, because this update involving Erika and Charlie Kirk was never meant to see daylight. And now that it has, the story feels a lot less settled than people were led to believe. For weeks, supporters were told everything was being handled privately, that rumors were exaggerated, that certain claims were misunderstandings taken out of context. On the outside, it looked like damage control had worked. The outrage cooled. The headlines slowed. And most people assumed the situation had quietly reached its end. But then things shifted. Suddenly, old conversations were being referenced again. Screenshots previously dismissed or ignored started resurfacing in new contexts. People who had gone silent were being mentioned by name. And most telling of all, the behavior of those closest to the situation began to change. Less confidence, less certainty, more avoidance. That's usually the first sign something didn't stay buried, according to online speculation. The latest update didn't come from a press release or a public statement. It came from loose ends private discussions allegedly leaking into public view. Bits and pieces, not enough to tell the full story, but enough to suggest the version people were given earlier may not have been complete. And once that possibility entered the conversation, everything changed. Because if nothing was wrong, why the sudden silence now? Observers began pointing out inconsistencies that had previously been brushed off, timelines that didn't quite line up, statements that seemed carefully worded to avoid specifics, moments where direct questions were answered with general responses. On their own, those details didn't seem alarming, but stacked together, they painted a picture of a story being managed, not clarified. That's when Erika's role started getting more attention. Online commentators began revisiting earlier claims involving her things that were initially dismissed as noise or drama. Old interviews, past statements, even casual comments made months ago were suddenly being replayed with fresh ears. Not because new proof had emerged, but because the context had changed. People weren't just asking what was said anymore. They were asking why it was said that way. Meanwhile, Charlie Kirk's name, already heavy with public influence, became the center of a different kind of conversation. Not direct accusations, but questions. Questions about awareness, about proximity, about what was known privately versus what was presented publicly. And those questions weren't coming from critics alone. Some longtime supporters started expressing discomfort, not anger, but confusion. They noticed the shift in tone, the lack of follow-up, the sudden reluctance to address topics that had once been confidently discussed. In internet culture, that kind of pivot never goes unnoticed. Then came the biggest red flag of all: backtracking. Small edits to earlier statements. Clarifications that raised more questions than they answered. People insisting they were misquoted without explaining the correct quote. It wasn't dramatic, but it was noticeable. And it fed the growing belief that the full story wasn't being told. This is where the phrase "this wasn't supposed to come out" started circulating, not as a confirmed fact, but as a reaction. Because when information is truly false, it's usually denied quickly and directly. What people saw instead was hesitation, delay, silence, and in some cases, complete disengagement. That kind of response doesn't automatically mean guilt, but it does suggest discomfort. And discomfort breeds speculation. Online, theories multiplied fast. Some believed the update involved private family matters that were accidentally exposed. Others thought it related to internal disagreements, conversations meant to stay behind closed doors that were never meant for public consumption. A few even suggested legal considerations were now at play, which would explain the sudden tightening of communication. What made the situation more intense was the absence of a clear counter-narrative. No definitive timeline. No point-by-point explanation. Just general statements urging people not to speculate. Ironically, fueling even more speculation. Because when people are told not to ask questions, they usually ask louder. As the update continued circulating, more people started noticing how selective the responses were. Certain topics were addressed quickly, while others were completely ignored. Some names were mentioned repeatedly. Others were avoided entirely. That selectiveness made the audience feel like they were being shown only what was safe to show. And that's when trust started eroding, not collapsing, but cracking. By the end of part one thing is clear. This update didn't shock people because it revealed everything. It shocked them because it suggested there is more. More context, more conversations, more decisions made away from public view. And whether those hidden details are damaging or simply misunderstood, the fact that they're being handled so carefully tells its own story. Because when information is harmless, it's shared openly. When it's sensitive, it's controlled. And when it leaks anyway, that's when people start asking who tried to keep it hidden. And why. In part two, we're going to break down what specifically changed, what people believe this update refers to, and why the reaction from both sides has been so cautious. Because if this truly wasn't supposed to come out, the fallout may only be starting once the initial shock wore off. Attention shifted from what had surfaced to how everyone involved reacted to it. And that's where this update involving Erika and Charlie Kirk became even more unsettling. Because the response wasn't loud. It wasn't defensive. It was careful. And careful responses often say more than emotional ones ever could, instead of clear denials or detailed explanations. What followed was a wave of controlled silence. Comments went unanswered. Certain posts were quietly deleted or restricted. People who had previously spoken freely about the situation suddenly stopped engaging altogether. To longtime observers, that kind of shift felt deliberate, almost strategic. Online, analysts began mapping the timeline. They noticed that shortly after the alleged new information started circulating, there was a noticeable change in communication patterns. Posts became less frequent. Messaging became more general. Direct references to Erika and the surrounding controversy were avoided, even when supporters asked questions respectfully. This wasn't chaos, it was containment. That alone raised eyebrows, because if the update was false or harmless, why the need to pull back? Some supporters argued that silence was the responsible move, that feeding speculation would only make things worse. But critics saw it differently. They felt the silence suggested that whatever had surfaced wasn't easily dismissible, not explosive enough to demand immediate public action, but serious enough to require caution. Then came the re-framing. Without addressing the update directly, some voices close to the situation began shifting the narrative toward misinterpretation, and context collapsed the idea that private conversations or partial information had been taken out of context and weaponized online. It was a subtle move, but a telling one. Instead of saying, "This didn't happen," the message became, "You don't have the full picture." And that distinction mattered, because it implied there was a fuller picture, just one the public wasn't being given. As speculation grew, attention turned to Erika's past statements, not because new accusations were being made, but because older claims suddenly felt unresolved. Commentators revisited moments where she had spoken vaguely, avoided specifics, or deferred answers to a later time that never came. Viewed through the lens of this new update, those moments felt less like coincidence and more like pattern. Still, no concrete evidence emerged, only questions. And questions, when left unanswered, tend to multiply. Charlie Kirk's position complicated things further. As a public figure, his involvement, direct or indirect, was always going to attract scrutiny. But instead of addressing the update head-on, references to it were sidestepped. The focus remained on broader messaging, values, and unrelated topics. That avoidance didn't go unnoticed. Critics argued that even acknowledging the confusion would have helped. Supporters countered that responding would legitimize rumors. The result? A stalemate where neither. A stalemate where neither. Then came the internal contradictions. A few secondary figures, people loosely connected to the SICDHN, made comments that didn't fully align with the primary narrative. Nothing dramatic, just small inconsistencies. Different phrasing, slightly different emphasis. On the surface, these differences seemed harmless, but to online communities already on edge, it felt like cracks. And cracks invite digging. Private messages allegedly began circulating, not verified, but widely discussed, suggesting that certain conversations were never meant to be public, that they were taken from moments of vulnerability, frustration, or internal disagreement. Again, nothing confirmed, but the idea itself added weight to the phrase. Everyone kept repeating, "This wasn't supposed to come out at this point." The conversation shifted again from outrage to credibility. People weren't demanding answers as loudly anymore. Instead, they were reassessing trust. Who had been transparent? Who had avoided clarity? Who benefited from the silence? And who was left confused by it? That's when the long-term implications became clear, even if the update itself never gets fully confirmed. The reaction to it has already changed how people view the situation. The careful wording, the selective engagement, the absence of firm rebuttals, all of it suggests that the truth, whatever it is more complicated than the public narrative ever implied. And complicated stories don't disappear quietly. They linger. They resurface. They evolve. By the end of part 2, the focus was no longer on whether the update was true or false. It was on why it caused such a cautious response, why it altered behavior, why it seemed to push everyone involved into defensive positioning without saying so outright. Because when people feel confident in the truth, they stand on it. When they feel uncertain or exposed, they manage it. And in part 3, we'll look at what this could mean going forward, the potential fallout, the questions that still haven't been answered, and why this story may not be finished. Even if no one ever officially addresses it again, by the time this update fully settled into public awareness, the reaction had shifted from shock to something more lasting: unease. Not outrage, not panic, but the kind of discomfort that lingers when people feel they've been shown only part of the truth. And that may be the most damaging outcome of all. At this stage, the conversation around Erika and Charlie Kirk is no longer centered on a single claim or leaked detail. Instead, it's about trust, how it was built, how it's being tested, and how quickly it can erode when transparency disappears. Even supporters who remain loyal have begun admitting that the silence feels different this time. More cautious, more guarded. What stands out most is that nobody has actually closed the door on the story. There hasn't been a definitive statement saying, this is false, and here's why. There hasn't been a clear explanation that settles timelines or clears confusion. Instead, there's been a slow retreat from the topic altogether, an approach that may reduce noise in the short term, but often backfires in the long run because unresolved stories don't fade. They mutate. Speculation fills the gaps. Theories become beliefs. Beliefs harden into narratives. And once that process starts, control over the story slips away no matter how carefully communication is managed. The very effort to contain the update may have unintentionally amplified its importance. Observers have also pointed out a deeper issue. This situation highlights the risk of blending private matters with public influence. When people connected to power platforms or large audiences handle controversy quietly, it creates an imbalance. The public is asked to trust without being informed, to move on without understanding. And not everyone is willing to do that anymore. As time passes, two things are likely to happen. Either more context will emerge intentionally, or not, or the story will remain unresolved, living in the background as a question mark that resurfaces whenever related topics arise. Neither outcome favors clarity, but only one offers the possibility of closure, for now. What remains is a noticeable shift in perception. The update may not have confirmed wrongdoing, but it has confirmed sensitivity. And sensitivity usually exists for a reason. Whether that reason is misunderstanding, miscommunication, or something deeper is still unknown. What's clear is that this wasn't just gossip. It wasn't just noise. The reaction proved that it touched something real, something people were uncomfortable seeing discussed openly. And that discomfort is what keeps this story alive. In the end, the most unsettling part isn't what came out, it's what still hasn't. Because when information escapes that wasn't meant to, it usually means there's more behind it. More context, more conversations, more truth waiting in the margins. And until that truth is addressed or decisively dismissed, this update will continue to follow Erika and Charlie Kirk, quietly reshaping how people see the story, and reminding everyone that once something slips into the public eye, there's no such thing as fully burying it again. Now, the real question is this: why did this hit such a nerve? If nothing about the Erika and Charlie Kirk update mattered, it wouldn't have triggered silence, careful wording, and sudden pullbacks. Yet here we are, with more questions than answers and a story that refuses to go away. Was this information truly harmless and misunderstood? Or did something surface that wasn't ready or safe to be discussed publicly? The reactions alone have convinced many that there's more beneath the surface, even if it's never officially confirmed. And in today's world, perception can be just as powerful as proof. So, what do you think? Was this a non-story blown out of proportion, or a glimpse behind the curtain that slipped out too early? Are people being protected, or is the truth being managed? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this conversation isn't over. Stay locked in for updates. Watch how the narrative shifts, and pay attention to what isn't being said. That's often where the real story lives. One thing is certain: once something escapes the shadows, it doesn't just disappear. And this update may be the one people keep coming back to.